Who's who and which David's which, it's time to find out what's what. Mr. Curator.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I now declare the museum open for donations. We'll start with David McCandless's room. Let's just get this door open. Although this room seems to be completely empty, there is something in it that gives me an overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't drop litter. I shouldn't slouch, put my hands in my pockets, run, dive bomb or pet in the pool while I'm in here. David, can you explain why?
Yes, David. My offering is the super ego.
Oh, good.
The superego is part of the model that Freud came up with to describe the structure of the personality. So Freud, back in early 1900s, in between taking loads and loads of cocaine, actually, he was an amazing user of the drug, and working with lots of mentally ill patients, observed...
Who would have thought that someone taking a lot of cocaine would have a superego?
Indeed. He observed three parts of the personality. The first part he called the it. The it is like your unconscious, your primal drives, a sort of instinctive, instant gratification, like a sort of nommy nom 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 kind of vibe. And then there's another part called the self, or the ego, which is just your normal self, the part of you that deals with reality. And then there's a part called the superego, literally the above I, and it's a part that sits on top of you, or above you, and it's an internalized version of all the authority figures you've had in your life, parents, priests, hosts of shows, and so on. And they're sort of internalized inside you, and it becomes an inner policeman. So it maintains the status quo and stops you from going beyond your limits as it perceives you, and induces that with fear and guilt. And he saw that very mentally ill people had a very massive superego that would actually crumple their existence. But apparently we all have it in our own lives ourselves, and sometimes it's like an inner voice, sometimes it's like a feeling, like fear or guilt, or sometimes it actually becomes very aggressive and attacks you, and you get a sort of superego attack. So I wanted to donate it to the museum because it feels like it's an antiquated thing. It's something we don't need anymore, and we don't need our sort of parent, policeman, kind of mother, chat show host along with us for the ride. So I felt like I wanted to give it to the museum as a way of getting rid of it.
Okay, I think I've understood that. What you're saying is you would like to give your conscience to the museum so that you can do whatever the hell you like.
Yeah, I think it acts as a conscience, but it gets drunk on power, a bit like the police do, or like politicians do, or any sort of authority figures. So it overdoes it, and it attacks you.
Does it mean that if we go into that room in the museum, we can have access to your conscience then?
Yeah.
Wow.
Maybe.
I don't know whether I want to go in there.
No. I can guarantee if you did that Hillary would walk in. If
We don't have a psychologist here, but do we still think that, or do we not believe in the superego anymore?
It's still in there. I mean, like Freud founded psychoanalysis, and it's become a bit more humanized now. So you have psychotherapy. They call the id the child, they call the self the ego still, and then they call the superego the parent. It gets in society, so you have a social superego, you have a cultural superego, the kind of thought police, if you like, and religiously speaking, of course, you have the ultimate superego, which is often in some religions known as God.
But Freud was a pretty screwy guy, wasn't he? He had all sorts of weird phobias, frightened of trains, saw his mother naked on a train when he was 2 and he never recovered from it. So even reading a railway timetable used to bring him out in cold sweats.
Yeah.
And somebody told me this story the other day, that when he was allowed to leave Nazi Germany, the Gestapo made him sign a piece of paper saying he hadn't been mistreated. And he was a kind of guy who slightly overdid a lot of things. And so instead of just writing, "I have not been mistreated," he wrote with a flourish at the bottom, "and I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone." It's kind of overkill, isn't it? Natalie, here's a Freudian question for you. Freud once said, "The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is, what does a woman want?" What do you feel about that?
I think a woman wants not to be treated as some sort of exotic subspecies by a coke-addled creep like Freud.
Well, I have a superego in the form of a producer who speaks in my ear, and he tells me it's time to accept your offer into the museum, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, for you, Natalie, we've done just as you asked and built you a little library. So let's just open the door. But what's this? Why, if it isn't Colonel Mustard, dead on the floor with a bit of lead pipe next to him.